Hello everyone, thank you for waiting. We were just waiting for a few extra people to join the session. I'm Jane Packer. I work in the committees team at BSI, which is responsible for standards development. Today, I'd like to introduce Verity and Victoria from the leading disability charity Leonard Cheshire. Verity and Victoria will facilitate today's session, which will explore what disability is, why it matters to business, and the lessons we can learn from lockdown. So over to Verity and Victoria.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Jane. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session on the future of work and disability inclusion. We're absolutely delighted to be here, and I hope you've had a fantastic day listening to all of the other speakers that BSI have had on offer. By way of introductions, my name is Verity Ailing-Smith and I work in the training and consultancy team at Leonard Cheshire. The purpose of today's session is really to consider disability, reflect on our experiences of work over the last few months, consider what changes we've had to make to those ways of working and what that really means for the future of work and disability inclusion here in the UK. We really hope that this session is going to be interesting and informative, but really practical in terms of the ways that we work. We really want you to feel comfortable and confident in asking us questions. So please do utilise the Q&A feature, which Jane will be monitoring throughout the session, and we'll ensure we've got lots of time at the end to answer your questions. So please do get involved. We'd love to hear from you. We'll also be launching quite a few polls during today's session just to understand a little bit more about you and the organisations in which you work or that you're affiliated with. Those questions will relate to your understandings of disability and sort of the ways your organisation likes to work. So hopefully we can give you a bit of food for thought to take away after today's session. I've done quite a lot of work with BSI over the last couple of years and supporting them in their inclusive as standard strategy. We've also developed training for BSI's teams to give them the knowledge, skills and confidence to work inclusively with committees. And I also sit on BSI's diversity and inclusivity advisory panel. So really delighted to be at the conference today. So before we begin, I'd like to pass over to my colleague and co-host Victoria to introduce herself and also introduce our organisation.
Thanks, Verity. Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria. I also work alongside Verity at Leonard Cheshire. I predominantly spend my time working on youth employment work. So my remit is all of our programming that supports young people with the transition from education into employment. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the programs that I manage, mainly Change 100 a little bit later on. But for those of you that aren't aware of Leonard Cheshire or might not know as much about kind of what we do beyond that, I wanted to give you a little bit of context on who we are and what we do. So Leonard Cheshire is one of the UK's largest disability charities, and we aim to support disabled people to live, learn and work as independently as they choose, whatever their ability. We work both here in the UK, but also internationally to open doors to opportunity and to really break down barriers for disabled people in lots of different elements of their lives. Within the UK, we have around 130 residential and supportive living services, which you might have seen if there are any near your hometowns. And you may have also seen some of our recent adverts and news coverage in relation to social care sector, again, here in the UK. We're quite a large charity, so we have 6,000 staff, around 8,500 volunteers, and we support more than 46,000 disabled people globally. So we have a huge scale. And we, again, this to influence change, and we do that through running programs like the ones I oversee to support disabled people to access work, education, digital inclusion, develop skills, become more active and engaged in their local communities. And we also support, which is kind of what me and Verity do in particular, support organisations to become more inclusive, more confident around disability through our programmes and consultancy services. I'll now hand back over to Verity, who will give you a bit more information and set the scene for today's session.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Vic. Obviously, we're talking today about the future of work and disability inclusion. And this question, what is disability, may sound incredibly basic, but actually perhaps it's a little bit more complicated or a little bit more complex. So we just wanted to pick this apart so that everyone's on the same page when we're talking about disability throughout today's session. So what we mean when we're talking about disability is Actually, we're talking about a very broad spectrum. We're talking about lots of different individuals who experience the world in lots of different ways. I think understandings of disability often perhaps assume that an individual might have a visible condition or impairment, or historically, perhaps we assume that an individual might be a wheelchair user, for example, like the blue badges that we see all over our towns. But actually, we're talking about individuals who might have a mobility impairment, a sensory impairment, like a hearing impairment or visual impairment. We're talking about an individual who might have a mental health condition, such as anxiety, depression, eating disorders. We could be talking about individuals who might have a neurodiverse condition, such as autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, or ADHD. But we could also mean anyone with a long-term condition. So that could mean asthma or arthritis, Crohn's, IBS, HIV, or diabetes. When we talk about disability, we talk about that incredibly broad umbrella approach. And lots of people will fall under that word of disability, that umbrella term. But many people who might have a condition or impairment that I've just mentioned might not identify with the word disability. What that means, though, is we still need to work inclusively with all of those people, all people who might fall under that definition, to ensure that we're removing barriers for them and we're working in inclusive ways. So in light of that, I'd like to launch our first poll, and I'd love to hear what you think the percentage of the UK population that has a disability is. So you should see a poll that's been launched on your screen now. So please do select the percentage of the UK population that you think has a disability, and you might reflect on some of those impairments and conditions that I mentioned just now. We're at about 45%, so I'll give people maybe 30 more seconds to complete that. This poll is anonymous, so please do feel free to answer as you see fit. Please don't be shy. Okay, just 10 more seconds for a few more stragglers. Okay, and I will share the results. I hope you can all see those. So the results of the poll, we have 23% saying that 20% of the population has a disability. Our highest figure is 30%. We then have a few responses for 40 and 60, and a few minor votes for 50 and 70%. So no one went below 20 and no one went higher than 70. So that's really interesting. If we can move on to our next slide, please, Victoria. The actual percentage of the UK population that has a disability is 21%. So that equates to 14.1 million people within the UK. That might be surprising to some of you, given the list that I've just mentioned there. But actually, in reality, that figure is probably likely to be a lot higher. And one of the reasons that is because of that identity question that I've already raised, that lots of people might not identify with having a disability, and therefore we won't know that information. However, when it comes to inclusive ways of working, our duty as employers and as providers of products and services remains the same. We still need to work inclusively with those people. So why does disability matter to business then? I've already talked about it's 21% of the population. Even if that figure is likely to be higher, 1 in 5 is still a considerable amount of our demographic, and also a considerable portion of our workforce as well. So when we talk to organizations, we really want them to understand that it makes really good business sense to understand what disability is and how to work in inclusive ways, because it's likely that many of your employees within your organization will be impacted by a disability or a long-term condition at some point in their employment with you. So in terms of the risks of getting this wrong, obviously we have a duty to remove barriers for disabled people. If we're not doing a very good job, we risk financial risks, being taken to court, legal risks, reputational risks, and no one wants to be the organization that's spoken about negatively online, on social media, about the way they treat people, whether that's their employees or their customers. If we're not doing disability inclusion well, we risk alienating the people that work for us. We risk people feeling undervalued. We risk people not performing to the best of their ability, or perhaps taking more long-term sickness absence. We also risk alienating customers and perhaps not showcasing ourselves as the organisations that we hope to be. But getting it right means that we have people who are engaged, we have consumers who are loyal, we have people who are at work, able to thrive, do their job, and to the best of their ability. We want to value inclusion. We should value inclusion because diversity for an organisation is a good thing. There are so many studies and research which shows why we shouldn't see inclusion as an add-on, as diversity as an add-on. It's a central part of our organization, and really we should put it at the forefront of all that we do to ensure that we value our people and work in the most inclusive ways. So obviously 2020 has been an incredibly difficult year for lots of different reasons, and I really wanted to use today's session to reflect on some of the learnings that we have from lockdown, what that's meant for disability inclusion and the ways in which we work. Because when we're talking about that figure, that 21%, that 1 in 5, that means that we will have disabled people who work for us, if we know it or not, and they may be working from home for the first time, they may be on furlough, they may be shielding. We need to ensure that across all of those different experiences that we're working in inclusive ways. So early on in March, I think it's fair to say we moved to new ways of working pretty quickly. A lot of organisations transitioned to working from home, or perhaps putting restrictions in place within workplaces to ensure that people could work safely. We had organizations, investing in technology overnight to ensure that their people had the equipment that they needed to do their jobs from home and work in new ways. I mentioned that as employers, we have a duty to make adjustments for disabled people. That duty exists when an individual might face barriers. So barriers can be lots of different things, from environmental factors like the built environment or the sensory environment, to organizational factors like the ways in which we work, how we communicate, or even attitudinal. So the attitudes that an individual acts upon, which create barriers for individuals. We could think about barriers in terms of inaccessible IT systems, communication methods, policies, processes, equipment, and workstations. When we move to new ways of working, it's really important to ensure that we're removing barriers in these new environments as well. I think there previously, back in March, might have been a misconception from employers that an individual transitioning to working from home will not face any barriers at home because it's their own personal environment, and it's an environment which is set up for them, that works for them perhaps, if they might have an impairment or condition. However, that's not the case. I think we treat our personal spaces and our professional spaces very differently. And so it's really important as organisations that we understand what barriers are so that we can effectively remove them. Barriers also exist in different forms, in different times, as perhaps our experience of the world or our environment or our situation fluctuates and changes. So we really need to ensure that we understand barriers and what adjustments could be so that we could effectively implement them. I'm talking a lot about barriers and adjustments today, and when we talk about a best practice approach for organisations, we really encourage organisations to have a very clear adjustment policy and process. So that means that people know how to request adjustments, that individuals know what that process looks like in terms of perhaps getting equipment or requesting changes to the ways in which they work. I would love to launch another poll to understand, for those of you that are joining us today, how many of your organisations have a clear adjustment policy and process. If you're not sure, if it's not something that you've heard of before within the context of your organisation, please select unsure. That's absolutely fine. What we're here today to do today is really talk about how we can embed some of these things. So we'll just give another sort of 10, 15 seconds. Okay, I will share those results. So really interesting to see. We've got about half saying yes and half saying unsure, with a few definitive no's. I think it's really important for an organisation to really showcase their commitment to diversity and inclusion, but also to show how they do that. And a clear adjustment policy and process is a really great example of that. So it's fantastic to see that half of you already have that in place. If we were able to have more of a discussion about that today, it would be so interesting to hear about your experiences of making those adjustments from home, because we're now working in those new environments and those barriers may have changed. And so those adjustments may also have changed. Back in March, we saw lots of people perhaps couriering their ergonomic chairs home, which is a fantastic example of an adjustment which can physically be moved from place to place. But barriers could also exist in perhaps the difficulty in separating work and life, or perhaps someone experiencing more barriers in relation to noise at home than they would usually do in the office. That's why it's really important for us to have that understanding of what barriers could be, and then what are the most effective adjustments that we can make for those individuals. And a policy and process is a really fantastic part of that. I think another learning from lockdown really has been the importance of managers. Managers have always played a vital role in supporting disabled employees within an organisation. They're often the main port of call for conversations relating to performance, attendance, behaviour, but they're also perhaps that first contact for an employee where those conversations, those one-to-ones, those professional development scenarios occur. But really what we've seen throughout lockdown, perhaps given this new way of working, is that organisations have really invested in the employee and manager relationship to such a great extent. I think since March, managers have really been encouraged, well, certainly across the organisations that I work with, managers have certainly been encouraged to really get to know their teams, ask, how are you, and really listen to the answer. Understand how people like to work, or perhaps understand people's personal situations a little bit more so that they can suggest changes to their working pattern or their working hours, which enable them to do their jobs in this unprecedented situation in which we find ourselves to the best of their ability. All of those things could be considered adjustments. Obviously, many of those conversations might not be disability related, but it certainly means that if we're improving those conversations, we have been seeing more examples of employees actually sharing information about a disability for the first time with their manager, because we finally see that relationship come to fruition. And perhaps managers, more so than last year, focusing more on outcome rather than the method in which people do their work or the hours which they work. And I think that's been a really fantastic learning and something we really hope to continue following lockdown. Obviously, I've mentioned the importance of managers, and we have a duty to make adjustments when a disabled employee faces barriers. But as I mentioned, individuals might not share that information with us, which is absolutely fine. Disability information is incredibly personal, it's sensitive data. And so an individual doesn't need to share that information explicitly in order to need adjustments or for a manager to make adjustments. So when we talk about managers and supporting their employees, we're also talking about the manager's ability to spot the signs that a disabled person might be facing barriers. That can certainly be done through these new ways of working, and it's something that we've really tried to address with the organisations we work with in terms of how do you spot the signs remotely. We're all living on Zoom. It's very possible to look out for those signs that, again, may be disability related, may not be, but flag to a manager that they need to have those conversations and say, I've noticed X, Y, or Z. Can we talk about this? How are you? As I said, I think those conversations have been happening more, which is a fantastic outcome. But to explain spotting the signs a little bit more, when it comes to employees, we often refer to signs that relate to appearance, performance, behaviour, and attendance. Those 4 factors are really key in enabling a manager to say, I noticed on Monday you appeared flustered, or your performance in this area is different to how it was before. I've noticed this change in your attendance or your behavior. Let's talk about that. And so when we train managers across organizations on disability confident management, we spend a really good portion of time talking about these signs, how to hold those really effective conversations, and then make adjustments. Essentially, that manager's role of that policy and process that we've just mentioned. From a lockdown perspective, I think these are happening more and more. And I think organizations, as I said, have invested so much more in those conversations. So I think organizations have learned a lot during this time about their people. So it was really, really important to reflect on that as an organization. How are you supporting your managers, and what can you do more or further in the future? In terms of other lockdown learnings, we've got feedback from disabled people here, and again, a number of organizations we work with have really taken the time to speak to their staff about how they are doing, but really direct some of that consultation to disabled people. So perhaps utilizing the reach of their employee resource groups as actually a key stakeholder group internally, or a fantastic consultative forum that an organization can take advantage of. How can a disability employee network support an organization's plans when they're considering how to return to work, for example? How have disabled people been factored in to changes which might need to be made to policies and processes now that we're working in new environments? There's some really fantastic examples of that happening across different industries. And so I would certainly wanted to highlight that as a learning that we want organizations to take from lockdown. Yes, consult with your staff, but also consult with the diverse demographic of your staff, and ensure that you're taking into account adjustments which might be required for disabled people through these very changing and tumultuous times. So moving on to the future of work, the idea behind today's session, I think a number of the things I've mentioned already during today's session are changes which disabled people have been requesting for many, many years in terms of employment, employers' attitudes, and changes which might be required to open up the job market and make more employment opportunities accessible. I mentioned that we've invested in new ways of working, and we did so incredibly quickly. If we think about how many organizations now have corporate Zoom accounts, or how many organizations have invested in their technical infrastructure to enable so many people to work from home, or given everyone laptops. What if individuals have now been given laptops who were previously told they couldn't work from home? Working from home, the flexibility to work at hours which suit an individual, the ability to have really frank conversations with managers, those are all changes or things that disabled people and organizations who support disabled people have been advocating for and requesting for such a long time. And so whilst 2020 has been a really difficult year, we really hope that investment in that infrastructure, in that technology, in those relationships means that that can continue. And actually, maybe that's a positive for the future of work and disability inclusion. Flexibility is so key for us all now in the ways that we work in this new COVID era. It's not something perhaps that many people have been able to take advantage of previously. So those conversations and that placing that emphasis on the importance of flexibility to enable people to work really effectively is something that we hope will stay for many years to come. As I mentioned, managers have been having perhaps better conversations with their employees. And again, we hope that that will continue, because whilst I've said it's a personal choice whether or not an individual shares disability information with their manager, with HR, with anyone for that matter, we do feel that there is value in supporting employees to share. Because if an individual faces barriers, perhaps we can have a better conversation with them or implement more effective adjustments if we're able to understand the impact that barrier is having upon them. I think it's really interesting here to flag that there have been some misconceptions throughout the pandemic in relation to vulnerability to COVID versus disability. And I think we need to be cautious there when we talk about what information we need to know as employers from perhaps a COVID vulnerability perspective when we're planning return to work, and what we need to know to practically work well with someone. I would say an illustrative example of this would be an individual with a visual impairment is not clinically vulnerable to COVID. Disability and COVID vulnerability are not the same things. However, an individual with a visual impairment may face more barriers during COVID than they previously did, because they are unable to visually perceive social distancing, for example, or they no longer feel able to use public transportation because perhaps assistance is no longer readily available in light of the pandemic. Those are conversations we should be having as an organisation and building those into our plans. We would love engagement with disabled employees to continue. We would love that investment in our employee resource groups as great support mechanisms and consultative forums to continue to ensure that the voices of disabled people are at the heart of every organisation and everything they do. Because without including all people within our plans as organisations, we risk alienating individuals and not working in the most inclusive ways. I think all of those things combined, as I've mentioned, could result in really positive changes for the future of work. And, you know, whilst, as I said, 2020 has not been the most positive of years, we hope that this slight silver lining to these changes will allow us to reduce the disability employment gap that we have here in the UK. A lot of work that Leonard Cheshire does is to reduce this disability employment gap. And so I'd love to hand over to Victoria to explain that a little bit more. What do we mean by the disability employment gap? What does it mean for COVID? And how are we trying to reduce it at Leonard Cheshire?
Thanks, Verity. Perfect. So you touched on a little bit around the employment gap, and I think it's really fantastic to see and hear about some of the learnings from the past 6 months and kind of some of the innovations that have happened. And how the future of work can be more inclusive for all. But I think it's also really important that the emphasis on disability inclusion continues. As you mentioned, it's been a long-standing challenge, and that just hasn't gone away in this new way of working. And in some ways, like you mentioned, it's become slightly more of a challenge to make sure that work is fully inclusive. Recently, Leonard Cheshire launched a new, as I mentioned at the start, employment campaign focusing on the impact specifically of COVID-19 on disabled workers and job seekers. We conducted nationwide research across the UK, and this statistic in particular we wanted to share, which says 54% of disabled people in the UK are not confident about being able to get a new job if they are made unemployed. So it's still, a significant level of fear and uncertainty for disabled job seekers and workers about reaccessing the employment space if they were to be made redundant during this time. And as we know, lots of people's jobs are being affected, but I think particularly for disabled people, there's a real concern that disability employment gap will widen. And as I mentioned, it was a significant challenge before. Let me just move forward. So these are some further stats that we wanted to share with you today, just to highlight that a little bit more and to give you a sense of what that level of employment gap is. So 53.6% of disabled people in the UK are employed, compared to 81.7% of non-disabled people. So it's a gap of about 28%. As I mentioned at the start, my work focuses particularly on youth employment, and so the stat that really resonates with me is the second one, actually. Around 77% of students and recent graduates with disabilities in the UK fear that they will be discriminated against if they were to share information about their disability or request adjustments, for example, in the recruitment process. There's a huge number of talented young people who may not apply for graduate level roles that they're perfectly qualified for because of fear of how they may be treated in the recruitment process, or kind of fear of judgment or discrimination if they were to ask for any kind of flexibility or changes. I think also there's such a large percentage of those, like I mentioned, who would not want to ask or not share and not request information and adjustments, even if it's advertised on websites that you will do that as part of the recruitment process. There's still a real fear that students will be discriminated against in that process if they were to ask for that. I think as well, particularly the next kind of 2 or 3 years, and something that we've seen a lot this year through the youth programs that I manage, that there'll be a real saturation of talent in the market as young people continue to graduate from college, school and university seeking work, but potentially the level of, or the number of graduate level roles will decrease in response to recession, uncertainty in the market, what we're seeing happening around coronavirus. And we've seen this summer, a huge number of internship schemes or graduate schemes cancelled or paused or put on hold until next year, which obviously has, a huge impact on all those leaving education. But I think particularly for graduates leaving or school leavers with disabilities, it's kind of an extra level of challenge where the pool and the number of roles will become a more competitive environment. So I think as the number of people leaving education doesn't decrease, it will keep going up every year. Opportunities may become smaller and smaller, and I think that's particularly where programs that I run can kind of help to facilitate that. But I think it's a real challenge for both job seekers and for employers to make sure that they're really seeking the best talent in the most kind of inclusive way. I think, as I mentioned before, and as Verity's touched on, there are huge opportunities for improvements and progress in regards to disability inclusion. I don't want to sound all doom and gloom about the statistics. I think there is huge potential for it to get much better. And I think there's a real opportunity for employers to take a step back and refresh their processes, reflect on how they are really accessing a diverse range of talent, how they can become more inclusive in that process and then more attractive to a broader range of candidates. I think for me, one of the things I wanted to share with you is a bit of the work that we do on the Change 100 programme. And after today, we can share a lot more information about this. So I won't go into too much detail, but we launched Change 100 back in 2014, and it has fundamentally kind of two main aims. It is a graduate talent programme that connects disabled students and graduates with some of the UK's best known employers through paid summer internships. We've so far supported over 600 interns through internships and over 160 employers on this journey. So that ranges from public sector, private sector, third sector organisations, including BMW, BBC, Heathrow, NHS, so a real range of different types of organisation. And we created it to really challenge people's or kind of misconception that existed that if you were to have a degree that you would find accessing graduate level roles really easy. But we found through some research that we conducted at Leonard Cheshire a number of years ago that there was a real significant gap between, like I mentioned on the employment gap, but a gap again between the number of graduates that would go on to would secure graduate level roles if they had disabilities compared to their non-disabled peers. The programme has two kind of predominant aims. One, to provide really kind of high quality graduate level work experience to graduates that is all about developing confidence, developing their skill sets, making sure they have kind of robust CVs that they can then go on to seek permanent work. And the second one, which is kind of I think longer term change that we try to see, is providing or challenging, supporting employers to think about how they can change their perceptions around disabled people, removing barriers in the workplace, really thinking and encouraging inclusive behaviours in terms of their early careers recruitment. So in a nutshell, we offer kind of a few different areas to that programme. So as I mentioned, interns will get 3-month internships. It usually runs kind of June to September. Usually in person in the office, but this year remotely at home. We also offer a professional development programme that sits alongside that internship, and that's to make sure that the young people that we support are really capitalising and making the most of their opportunity. We run monthly events that will focus on soft skills development, but also give some more kind of bespoke support on how to handle difficult conversations around disability with their managers, how to kind of be able to demonstrate the skills they've developed through resilience or from their experience at university if they haven't necessarily got lots of work experience before. So we work with them, like I say, over 6 months to really make sure they capitalise on that opportunity of their internship. We also match each intern to a mentor that's within their host organisation. And that's to make sure, again, that they can get some professional advice and some guidance from someone who's outside of their immediate team to kind of help build their professional network as they move forward through their kind of career. And then for employers, we offer a lot of different types of bespoke support. So we have a lot of kind of one-on-one support for managers who are involved in the programme. But we also do a disability session at the start of the placement to kind of make sure everybody who's involved in the programme has a standard level of understanding about what we do and what the programme is, its aims, and about disability. And then bespoke session for each individual intern around their adjustments, what kind of work support they might need, to make sure that the managers and mentors feel really able to support them in the best possible way. This year, as you can imagine, it's been quite a different year to normal. So we've innovated really quickly, like most of you have, I'm sure, to be able to support and run the programme fully remotely. We've made lots of innovations to make sure that we can do that. So it's through kind of lots of Zoom training, supporting for interns that's more creative and virtual. And we've actually found that even a programme like ours, who focuses purely on supporting disabled graduates, we've even learned a lot about how to make the programme, one step further and even more inclusive. So lots of the learning that we've had this year, we will keep and embed moving forward in the future as well, to kind of constantly make it more inclusive, as lots of our interns found that working from home is hugely beneficial from a kind of managing their disability or condition. I wanted just to show a quick video, which is one of our partners that was on the programme, has been on the programme since 2017, one of our largest partners, Intercontinental Hotels Group, which just gives you a little bit, it's only 1 minute long, a little bit of an introduction and summary of the programme from an employer perspective. Hopefully the sound will work.
My name's Karina O'Gorman and I'm the Head of Corporate Responsibility at Intercontinental Hotels Group. As a company, IHG has supported Change 100 for many years. For any business looking for a few different things, one, to get new ideas, new passion, new excitement, having interns is always a great way to do that. And then actually supporting the Change 100 programme to find interns through that way. It really helps you make sure that you are building a diverse and inclusive workforce for the future. We know that's what will make successful businesses. Having people with a disability in your organisation showing you how you can adapt and can only be a good thing to help us have more inclusive workforces for the next generation. For me, I absolutely love seeing our interns come in and how they change and develop and grow in confidence over the time that they're with us. It's exciting to see the opportunities you're able to give someone and help them on their career journey.
Perfect. So as I mentioned, IHG have been a partner a number of years, and I think some of the feedback that we get through the programme is that from an employer perspective, it's a really great way to kind of expose some of the things within your organisation that you do want to improve, or also expose where there's really great practice. So some of our employers who partner with us are quite apprehensive about whether they can support disabled interns in full, and that they'll have all the tools and resources they need, and then they work with us and find out it's a very simple and easy process to support someone with a adjustment or a disability or condition. So it's a really kind of useful programme, I think, for employers to kind of sense check where they are with their own kind of internal processes, and that kind of help feeds into some of the work Verity does around kind of additional consultancy and support there. So we had lots of, like I said, after today we'll share a bit more information about the programme and I can share an impact report, but I just wanted to highlight this one quote from Tony Vincent, who works at one of our partner employers, a different one, Royal Berkshire Fire and Rescue Services, who continued to work with us this summer despite kind of the challenges that were presented from COVID, and some of the learning that they've had. I think they were, traditionally very office-based organisation, had to have a huge change overnight to working from home, working remotely. And I think for them, being part of Change 100 has also kind of highlight how easy that is actually, and how you can make small changes that then enable you to support all staff. And so a lot of the inclusive processes they put in place for their interns have actually brought benefits to all their staff, which has been really lovely to see. But I'll just read through the quote before I hand back over to Verity as well. But Tony said, 2020 has proved beyond any reasonable doubt that it's entirely possible. Sorry, your pictures are in my way. That it's entirely possible to recruit, onboard and manage and offboard staff 100% remotely. It means that we'll be able to consider applicants for positions that previously we wouldn't have considered, and widen our recruitment campaigns for specific types of roles to national or even international scopes, massively enlarging the pool of talent that we can recruit from. Of course, this learning is perhaps even more pertinent for potential applicants with disabilities, where roles would usually be office-based. For 2020 in particular, this new approach shows the benefit that engaging with Leonard Cheshire in the Change 100 programme can bring to any organisation. And I think, again, it's been really interesting to see the impact, actually, that employers kind of coming out of the other side of kind of lockdown and home working have really seen, like, the the potential that it has to diversify their talent pool and bringing a broader range of people into their organisations, which has been great. I will hand over back to Verity.
Thanks so much, Victoria. I think just to sort of reiterate some of the points that you've made in terms of how Change 100 relates to the future of work and disability inclusion, I think obviously Change 100 is a programme that we're incredibly proud of, but I do think that it's a fantastic example of how we have used 2020, or organisations have used 2020, whilst it's been a very difficult year, to innovate and to reflect and to change. And I think Tony's quote here really showcases how even organisations who are very committed to doing this always learn. We as an organisation, as Leonard Cheshire, as a provider of programmes like Change 100, as Vic said, we learn every single year because individuals are different and situations are different, and the barriers that people might face are individual. That's what they are. And so that's why when we talk about the future of work and disability inclusion, most of our key messaging revolves around having those conversations, understanding your people, and being able to effectively understand what barriers are so that we can make the best adjustments. I often talk to organisations about their adjustment policies and processes. That's a part of my role. And we say that a best practice approach is really based on that individual approach. Many organisations might have experience of making adjustments where, for example, an individual with dyslexia requires adjustments and an employer says, oh, we've made adjustments before, you need X, Y, or Z piece of tech. That may work perfectly for them, but everyone experiences their own disability in their own unique personal way. So we really want to understand individuals before we can make those solutions. I'm sure some people on the call are incredibly knowledgeable in this area and have experience of making adjustments for their employees or for their customers or other stakeholders, and others perhaps aren't so confident. But I would reiterate that you will employ disabled people and you will work alongside disabled people as employees or customers, whether you know it or not. And so whilst some of this information might feel a bit further removed, these are really good practices which we should all be implementing to work in more inclusive ways. And I certainly think that this year has been a real catalyst for that change. And we really hope that that will continue. I'm conscious of time, and I know that Victoria and I could probably have a conversation about these changes and about our work and what we're hoping to do, but we wanted to really allow enough time for questions. I know we have Jane, who's kindly volunteered to moderate some of the questions for us. So Jane, do we have any questions in the Q&A?
Yes, thank you for that, Victoria and Verity. It's very interesting. I mean, I had a question myself really to start with, and that was around the Change 100 programme, which I know a little bit about because I've done some work with you in the past. But how does an employer get involved? If anybody who's listening to this now that really wants to get involved in that programme, how easy is that?
Yeah, great question, Jane. Probably should have told you guys that straight away. It's really like if you wanted to have an initial conversation, if an employer, if you are interested in being partners with us and taking part in the programme, we can after today share the website, but you can get in touch with us at change100@leonardcheshire.org. And we have a couple of team members in my team, one who looks after our corporate partnerships and one that looks after our public sector and non-profit organisations, and we can speak to you kind of how that works and what the programme involves and kind of some of the deadlines. We're now recruiting employers for 2021, so placements will usually start in June if everything runs to time next year, and employers have up until kind of April to sign up if they're keen to host an intern. But yeah, we're always looking for a huge range of companies. It doesn't matter how big or small or where you're based. We're always looking, our students have a huge range of interests across lots of different careers. So any kind of role, we're always looking for new partners.
I may have missed it on your slide. How many are you doing at one time? So how many placements do you run at one time in that period?
Yeah, it varies every year. So the largest year we've had was around 160, 150 interns in one go. And then our employers will range between having just one intern. So lots of our new partners will just host one. Our largest partner this year was on track to host 15, but today the largest is around 10 interns in one go. So we're happy for employers to kind of try the programme with just one intern, but we'll usually next year aiming for around 100, 150 interns again as part of the cohort.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've got a question online. Let's have a look. So the question we have is, does the language we use cast disability in a negative light?
I'll take that question. It's a really interesting question. I think, you know, by the nature of the prefix of the word, it's framed in a very negative way. Disability related language is really complicated because it differs all over the world, wherever you're from, and also relates to how people identify, what they like to call themselves. I mentioned that a lot of people might not identify with the word disability because perhaps they think it has negative connotations, or previously has done, or they've had bad experiences in the past. So certainly language is a difficult subject for some people. In terms of understanding the language we use, you may have heard that Victoria and I referred to disabled people throughout today's session, and that really is in relation to what we call the social model of disability. So the social model of disability is something we really advocate for at Leonard Cheshire, and essentially the model understands disability as an individual might have an impairment or condition like the ones I mentioned at the front of this presentation, but they are disabled by the barriers that exist within society. I've obviously spoken a lot about barriers during today, so those environmental barriers, those organizational barriers, those attitudinal barriers. That is what disables a person. It's that verb, it's that action that an individual is disabled, which is why Victoria and I are using that particular language. The classic example of social model illustration that you will hear everywhere is that an individual might have a mobility impairment and they use a wheelchair. They are not disabled until they come across a flight of stairs, because it is at that point that they are unable to participate in that meeting or that class or be treated equally to their friends and peers, perhaps who don't use wheelchairs. That's the difference. Other examples could be an individual who uses British Sign Language. They might have a hearing impairment, and so they use British Sign Language, but they are not disabled until they go to a town meeting where there is no BSL interpreter. That is at the point that they are disabled. So we hear lots of organizations wanting to use different language, like differently abled or diverse abilities. I would argue that everyone's differently abled and everyone has diverse abilities. And the thing I like about disabled people as a concept is that we're talking about the problem being with society, not the problem being with the individual. Diverse abilities and differently abled still puts that factor on the individual themselves, not on society. So that's why I perhaps steer away from those. Internationally, because I know lots of you probably work for global organizations or are involved in international standards development, the preferred terminology is persons with a disability or people with disabilities. That's because that reflects the language used in the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and is called person first language. So the person comes first. Both are politically correct terms. We are using disabled people because it's generally preferred in the UK because of that social model. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry, Jane. I hope that answered the question. It's quite complicated.
I'm sure we'll get a note in the Q&A if the person thinks we haven't answered it, but I think that was a good answer. We have another one online here. So this one is any suggestions as to how BSI can get broader representation from organisations that represent people with disabilities?
It's a really good question. And I know BSI are really working to ensure that standards development is inclusive, that you have a diverse representation of people within the room, and that you are also championing inclusive practice. So it's a really great question. I really would encourage any organization, including BSI, to really shout about your commitment, but also why. Why are you committed to it? What is the value? We say this when we ask about why are you asking people to share disability information? What are you going to use that information for? What benefit is it to you as an organization? I would argue, BSI wanting to have involvement means that standards development's more diverse, that those standards work for those people, that BSI sees difference as a good thing. using that language to championing this and seek out organizations who share those values, who have networks of individuals who identify in different ways, I think is really powerful. There are lots of different organizations all over the UK who work in particular disabilities. We as an organization, we generally call ourselves a pan disability organization. And what that means is we work with any individual or talk about disability in the broadest sense of the term. But obviously you've got organizations like Mind who focus on mental health, or Arthritis UK who focus on arthritis. So I would really encourage any organization, including BSI, to seek out the leaders in that space. Who's talking about it? Who's campaigning for change? There are lots of networks as well where charities come together to share best practice and knowledge, but to really utilize those connections and reach people who also engage with those organizations as well. When we talk about standards development, I know that lots of standards makers, for example, will work for particular organizations, but those organizations might have employee resource groups. They might have disability employee networks where people might actually be really, really keen or engaged and want to get involved in committees. I would say that solution or that idea also relates to any other protected characteristic, as we see lots of organizations have BAME networks, women's networks, pride networks, carers networks, parents networks. If you're trying to reach a broad range of people, I would go to organizations, networks, and specialists in that area who champion that work.
Yeah, that's great, Verity. I think we can definitely have a conversation, and maybe you can fill in some of the blanks for us if we're missing some of these organisations. I'm sure you have a lot of experience of all these different organisations and networks. Thank you. Let's have a look. I think more questions. Let's have a look. So another question really following from that, do you think that those organisations are going to be more challenged to commit to representation because of the pandemic? And how can we make standards more accessible? There we go. 2 questions in one.
I think to touch on the first point, I think because we have seen people engaging with their employees at a more individual level, I think we might see organizations being held accountable perhaps for more representation and supporting individuals however they identify, whatever protected characteristic that is. I would say, we specialize in disability, so I wouldn't want to provide an answer for all of the inclusion and diversity space, but I would say that as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the coverage surrounding George Floyd, that I think diversity and inclusion has really come to the fore during 2020, and is something that a lot of organizations have started to use this pit stop, this break perhaps that 2020 may have afforded, to reflect and look at their impact upon their people and the people that they work with, or the demographics that they're hoping to serve. So I certainly think that the pandemic and the timing of 2020 has certainly allowed for that. I think how you make standards accessible, it's a very, very big question, and I'm sure we'd love to keep working with BSI to work that out. There are so many factors involved, not just getting the right people in the right room, but ensuring that the processes themselves are accessible, the ways that they're communicated are accessible, that anyone who needs to digest that information can do so in an accessible way for them. So I think that's multifaceted, but really happy to continue that chat with BSI.
Thank you, Verity. I think we have around 5 minutes left, so let's see if we have some more questions. I had a question. I wrote a few questions down before we started. So thinking back to your presentation, Verity, what should disability groups be doing to influence their employers' approach to the easing of lockdown?
I think obviously I mentioned employee resource groups and getting feedback from disabled people. And I think when we talk about the easing of lockdown and return to work, I think it's really important that we're engaging with our people. And so we're engaging with those networks. And so I think disability networks or disabled employee groups or whatever language you use within your organization, or individuals even, have to give that feedback, have to play that part. And I think organizations should give them that space to contribute. I've worked with an organization called Merkle around their management and how they support employees, how they make adjustments. I can certainly circulate a case study in relation to that work after today. But a fantastic thing about that organization is how closely that their HR team works with what they call their disability pillar, and how integral that disability pillar is to making decisions about policies and processes that impact all people, not just those with disabilities. So I think having that close relationship, if possible, within an organization, to me, really showcases the importance, and for all employees might make them feel more valued, or might make them feel more likely to share, and particularly given the changing situation we find ourselves in, they might feel more comfortable to share any concerns or worries or questions they have in relation to returning to work, or any vulnerability to COVID that they might not have previously shared.
And somebody has just reminded us that, you know, BSI does have a consumer network that does represent the voice of consumers in the development of standards. And there's one in particular at the moment which she asked me to mention, which is the Standard on Dementia Inclusive Communities and Accessible.
Great.
So yeah, let's have a look. I think we have 3 minutes left. So there's another question here. Is there a danger of disadvantaging registered disabled individuals by conflating them with a much wider population of general disabilities?
Oh, interesting question. So in terms of the registration of disabled individuals, obviously it's a complex one. When we're talking about things like benefits and particular support, there is that kind of, I wouldn't say registration, but there is that criteria or eligibility that is slightly different. So perhaps we might talk more about registered disabled. My understanding is that the only registered disability that you can have is being blind. You're registered blind. When we can talk about the Equality Act and the legal definition of disability for days on end, but technically in relation to the definition, only a tribunal or court can decide if an individual meets that definition. So no one is registered disabled apart from registered blind. That's the only time I would use that terminology. There are, however, I believe 5 particular conditions or impairments which are mentioned in law, which are protected by the Equality Act at the point of diagnosis. So that won't go to a tribunal or court to consider if they do or do not meet that definition. And those do include being blind, disfigurement, HIV, among a couple of others as well. So I would say that we should start using disability in a way that represents the broadest sense of people. I think people will identify in different ways. Some people might say they're registered disabled. That might mean different things to them. It might mean the benefits or the support that they access. It might mean that they get that they access social care. It might mean that they have a blue badge. The language that people use to describe themselves is very different, but in order to educate people about disability and how to work inclusively, I think it's really important that we take that social model approach and we ensure that we're removing barriers for individuals and speaking to individuals as they are, which is individuals, and making sure that we work in a way that best suits them.
Brilliant, thanks. We have 1 minute left, so if anybody's got a question, if you could pop it in the chat quickly before we end. Otherwise, all there is left to do is to thank you so much for joining us today. It was a very interesting presentation, and if anybody's interested in the Change 100, Victoria put the details in the chat, and please do even just look at their website to get more information about that program. Definitely no more questions, so that's it. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for attending, and have a nice evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.